Great. How are we? Good. It's good to see everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Kaylee Cook. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Communication. I'll be your moderator today. Today we're going to hear from a captivating researcher who looks at social media, youth practices, and intersections between technology and society. She studies behavior of teens on social networks and works to help adults better understand teens' behavior online. I really liked the quote at the beginning of the book. By and large, the kids are all right, but they want to be understood, she says. And by the way, that's from her book, It's Complicated, which was out February 25, and you'll be able to buy a copy right outside the door for $25 when you're ready. The way we'll structure the event today is we're going to first hear a presentation from Ms. Boyd, and then we'll transition to a panel of questions from three wonderful students in the Department of Communication. Before we open up the floor microphone to questions, we'll have someone moderate that as well. So let me first introduce you to our panelists who will be conversing with Ms. Boyd. I'll start with Elizabeth Lowry. She grew up in the 1980s in a subdivision of about 500 ranch-style homes on the edge of Oklahoma City, 11 miles from her high school and 5 miles from the nearest grocery store. The mailbox, a landline, and cable TV were her portals to the world. In her 9th grade Oklahoma history class, Elizabeth engaged in a primitive form of texting, she says, by writing comments in a notebook and passing it back and forth with Susie Schweitzer. When her teacher wasn't looking, of course. They were never caught, for anyone who's interested. Elizabeth went on to earn her bachelor's degree in journalism. She was a newspaper reporter, a high school journalism teacher, and a communications director. Today, Elizabeth is a communications director for the UW Graduate School, a graduate student in the Communication Leadership Program, and the mother of a freshman at Western Washington University and a junior at Franklin High School here in Seattle. Elizabeth. Next, we have Mr. Austin Williams. He is a University of Washington student majoring in journalism in the Department of Communication. He's a filmmaker, having spent 4 years in his high school video production program in Westchester, PA. In 2013, he was named a Mary Gates Scholar for Leadership. He's a former student athlete who was recruited and played football at St. Francis University in Western Pennsylvania before hanging up his cleats to pursue his dream of filmmaking. Austin produces a web show, a very good web show, by the way, called What's Good 206. He's interested in pursuing a career in television as a writer and producer. Austin Williams. And last but certainly not least, Liz Cortez is a PhD student in the Department of Communication at the University of Washington, where she also received her MA. She received her bachelor's degree in Women's and General Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on the ways in which the search engine constructs representations of race and gender. Much like television and film, search results both reflect and construct the world, thus generating particular meanings. In order to analyze this form of representation, Elizabeth proposes an approach that critically analyzes both the search results that appear on screen and the mechanisms occurring behind the screen. So Liz Cortez. These three brilliant individuals will pepper Ms. Boyd with questions later on in the event. Austin is also curating and presenting tweets from you and the public using the hashtag DBoyd, B-O-Y-D, UW. So don't hesitate to get involved and ask Danah questions anytime during the presentation. Austin is keeping track. And we're looking forward to her answers. So Ms. Boyd is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, a research assistant professor in media, culture, and communication at NYU, and a fellow at Harvard's Berkman Center. She holds a PhD from the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley, a master's degree from MIT, and a BS in computer science from Brown University. In 2014, she started a very interesting think/do tank called the Data and Society Research Institute. She's focused on research questions now related to big data, privacy, publicity, youth, and human trafficking. Her second book, It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Network Teens, about how teens communicate through social services like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and others, just came out. Please join me in enthusiastically welcoming Danah Boyd.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out today. So I'm really excited to be here at UW. I'm excited to be here to tell you about my book. And I'm partially excited because I have no idea how many of you are in the room to hear the researcher side, the parenting side, the youth side. And I'm going to do my best to try to address a variety of different aspects of what my research has been about. But I'm also really excited to be in a space where we can ask a lot of questions. So I'm going to invite you to really engage and think about the things you want to know. First, I'm going to provide some context, both to this book and to the project writ large. I should begin by saying that I was one of the first of cohorts who actually grew up online. I got online as a teenager, in part because my brother had acquired a computer, and he did a thing that was absolutely terrible for teen girls, which is that he kept hooking it up to the phone line. And I was really horrified because he was using up the phone line and it kept making these horrible screechy, beepy sounds. And at one point I marched into his room and I'm like, what are you doing? And he showed me a world of Usenet and bulletin boards. And all of a sudden, that piece of metal and plastic turned into be much more interesting to me. Because all of a sudden I realized that the computer was made of people. And I was really enamored with the possibilities of connecting. And indeed, I spent my teenage years talking to strangers in an era where it was not actually a bad thing to talk to strangers. And I had my eyes opened in really phenomenal ways. It was during the first Gulf War, and I got to talk to all of these soldiers who were experiencing what it meant to be in the Middle East. And I got to ask questions about our geopolitics in ways that I was not really understanding what was going on. I talked to a transgender woman who helped me understand the politics of gender and sexuality in really phenomenal ways, in ways that I think back about the questions I must have asked her, and I'm sure they were absolutely horrific, but yet she was willing to humor me and tell me about her life. And it was a really empowering moment for me to sort of connect, to understand a world that was bigger than my hometown in Pennsylvania. And so, as I did all of this, it wasn't in a moment where we were afraid of technology. It was a moment in which the idea that teenagers were using technology meant that they must be doing something educational, right? And so it was sort of funny because, of course, my mother would go to bed and we would get on late at night and spend all night up and sleep during class, do all the things that teenagers aren't supposed to do. And the only reason that we ever got into trouble was because, of course, we racked up a $700 phone bill in an era in which every call that you would make to a bulletin board system was a long-distance call. So my brother and I sort of scratched our heads and figured out what were we going to do, because we didn't want to get off of this computer thing. And of course, not understanding the law, not understanding what is appropriate or not, we figured out that you could connect our phone line to somebody else's phone line and let them get the charges, right? Well, that didn't go over well either. So I spent a lot of those teen years sort of grappling with what it meant to sort of be in a culture where we were just trying to work these things out. So I went to college to study computer science. I thought that I would build the systems that I was so in love with. And indeed, it was an amazing program. For those who are familiar with Brown's computer science department, which would be basically all of your computer science department, has connections in funny ways. It was an amazing place to sort of experience and be exposed to phenomenal research. But I kept asking questions about people and their practices. And I started doing a lot of visualization work, trying to visualize relationships between networks. But what I really wanted to know was what was sort of underneath that. What were the people and their practices? And so, at the time I was doing a lot of this work, a site popped up called Friendster. It was the first of the major social network sites. And I became enamored with trying to understand it. I had been blogging since 1997. So I basically started blogging my reflections and my thoughts about this new site about 6 months before the first coverage by news media. And then I decided I would just start interviewing people about how they were using social media. And this was an amazing project, amazing way of looking at things. And then I was back in graduate school studying under anthropologists. And my advisor came to me and said, hey, are you interested in young people? And I said, sure. And he said, I've got funding to do this project. Would you work with me on it? And I said, of course. And I decided that I would go and I would look at how things had transformed since my teenage years. My expectation going into this project was that young people must have had their worlds blown open in phenomenal ways. Things that must be radically different. I saw the internet as a saving grace for me. It must be so amazing for young people. And I went, and started talking to teenagers, started trying to understand what was going on, and of course quickly learned that the more things changed, the more they seemed to stay the same. And so as I was doing this research, trying to understand sort of classic academic questions about power, about peer sociality, about status and identity, I kept encountering an amazing amount of fear and anxiety from adults, whether it was journalists, whether it was parents, whether it was politicians. And I kept sort of tracking all of these fears and being like, actually, I have tremendous data that would speak to that. And so basically, after many years of writing academic and scholarly works and blogging on the side and sort of having fun with it, I decided to try to write a book that would sort of address all of these issues in a coherent way for the public writ large. And by the way, there's about 50 pages of endnotes for those who want the scholarly bits. But so It's Complicated was my attempt to address what was really a decade worth of kids these days concerns. But I want to sort of step back and say, what is it about social media? Because one of the driving conversations about this is that social media must be this attractor. There must be something about the internet that just pulls people in. And it was that concern that sort of began a lot of these questions. And what I realized is that we didn't have a public conversation about other things that had changed at the same time as this internet issue had come into being. That the last 30 years in American society have actually gone through tremendous transformations that in many ways are undiscussed. And I want to put those in context so you can understand what's happening with social media. It wasn't many generations ago where everybody could get on their bike and be home by dark wherever they were in this country, and it just wasn't a big deal. Young people were working, young people were out and about, people weren't very anxious about them. Things really changed in the 1980s, and we saw the implementation of massive curfew laws in order to keep young people safe from the terrible dangers of both urban and suburban life. In light of that also, we started seeing these concerns about latchkey kids, the idea that kids being alone at home meant that they were going to be in massive amounts of trouble, that they would never become anything of importance. And so indeed, we saw this response be to create structured activities. And so today's young people are in structured environments from morning to night, particularly in middle and upper class America. On top of that, we saw a change in school organization. Schools started moving further out in town in order for them to get new land, and it was cheaper there. The result of which is that the ability to walk to school became extraordinarily difficult for most youth, even though walking to school was one of the ways that young people would casually socialize with their peers. Today's young people are more likely to be dropped off at school than any previous generation, really cutting down the time in which they can spend with their friends. The time between bells has shrunk. The ability to have notions of recess or free time has been minimized. I go into schools where lunch is a silent period. The idea of just being able to socialize has been radically minimized. Meanwhile, because of school choice and suburbanization, young people's friends are more likely to be at a further distance geographically, that even if they could walk or bike, even if they were allowed outside, it doesn't mean that they could get to their friends. So they rely on their parents to drive them. But their parents are more likely to be working double jobs, which makes the possibility of maneuvering very difficult. And of course, what we've turned socializing for young people into is a glorified play date well into high school. The idea that it's just one-to-one rather than large group interactions. Public spaces have shooed young people out. Malls have restrictions. Parking lots have trespassing laws. All the places in which young people have historically gathered have told them that they're not wanted. Young people's access to their own money has also declined. For example, the idea of that, questionable labor of babysitting when you're 12. Most middle-class parents do not want 12-year-olds babysitting their 3-year-old. We don't see the access to fast food jobs, especially for middle-class youth, because those jobs are given to 50-something in an economy that's very much on decline. We have all of these sort of structural changes at play alongside an increase in fear, an increase in anxiety, a radically proliferating concern about how dangerous the world is for today's youth, even as all of the data has shown that things have been on the decline during the same period for a long time. So along comes technology. And what happens is that young people basically see this as a relief valve. They know that they can get together with their friends, and it solves a really important issue. It solves a collective action problem. Because even if your parents let you go out, even if you've got public transportation and can go where you would like to, that doesn't mean your friends can. And so this is one of the challenges for teenagers, where they're trying to constantly negotiate where can they get together with all of their friends. And the internet has provided a space for which that is really amazingly valuable in the US. It's also one of the reasons why the US dynamics look different than elsewhere around the globe. So young people have flocked to the online world really to hang out with their friends, to socialize, to gossip, to joke around, to do all of the things that teenagers have always done. And that means good, bad, and ugly, right? And I think this is what we struggle with, because what happens is the online environment makes young people more visible than ever before. And so in an American society where we've created gated communities and we've tried to segregate based on race and class, what happens is when everybody piles on to social media, you see across class lines, you see across race lines, and you watch as the elite part of this country flips out because they're not prepared for their children to be exposed to worlds that are quite different than them. And so we've had this sort of conflict and these challenges, and over again, we think that things are so much worse because of the internet, when the data consistently shows that that's often not the case. But that visibility is a mixed blessing. It allows young people to explore, it allows them to connect with their friends and their peers, but it also is a place where they show that they're not doing so good. Because when I say that the kids are by and large all right, what I mean is that most young people are as good as they've been. And there are a lot of young people who are really having a hard time. They're facing stress and anxiety because of a variety of factors in their environment. They're dealing with abuse, they're dealing with alcoholism, they're dealing with factors, in their home and community that are really significant. And that all becomes visible online. And what's been heartbreaking to me as I've started doing all of this work is that I realize that as young people put this material out online, as they make this all visible, we react to the technology by wanting to make it go away, wanting to blame the technology for the things that are made visible, even though the opportunities for intervention are absolutely phenomenal. The opportunities to make a difference in people's lives because we can see the struggles that they're going through. And this is, of course, where we get back to that classic conversation that Jane Jacobs started quite some time ago. The preeminent scholar, she was always challenging these public notions of what it means to create safety. And she made this argument that safety is achieved in public spaces because of eyes on the street. It's what happens when the entire community comes together and is willing to actually be a part of the fabric of society, to pay attention, to be sitting on their stoop. And that when people retreat indoors, when people lock themselves out of the conversation, that's where we start to see risks magnify in significant ways. The same is true online. The internet, in many ways, is safer when we all collectively agree to participate, when we look out for the people who are struggling, when we pay attention to what's going on. And so one of the things is, as I write this book, there's obviously a lot of scholarly conversations that this is rooted in, and it's rooted in a lot of data, and we can talk about methods, in the conversation. But one of the things that I wrote this book to do is to open people's eyes to the complexity and the challenges of what young people's lives look like, and to help people realize that all of these things that are changing show a variety of other things that are at play. And so that rather than getting anxious about the technology, rather than using the technology as the point of conversation, how do we use it to see things and to appreciate the challenges and to make interventions that can make a difference in people's lives? And with that introduction to start off, I'm going to sort of switch to the panel and I'm looking forward to all of your questions. Thank you.
All right, are we mic'd up okay? Everyone hear us okay? All right. Right on. I was hoping to start with Elizabeth. Elizabeth had a question about what some teachers and parents can do to use social media to engage. I'm hoping you can elaborate a little bit. It should pick you up.
Okay. As you point out, Dana,
Are you able to hear back there?
Can you guys hear? Oh.
Okay.
How about now? Great. All right, we'll try that.
So, Dana, you had pointed out that social media provides us, as parents and adults, many opportunities to kind of check in on kids and see how they're doing, but I find that really difficult when my son unfriends me on Facebook or when they, use pseudonyms on Twitter and that kind of thing. So how do you balance what's an appropriate amount of surveillance versus invading?
Yep. No, it's a good question. I'm good. So part of it is to realize that, in American society, another big transformation is that young people today have less access to non-custodial adults in their life than ever before. we now expect parents to do all of the work of keeping their children safe rather than actually building out a network or community. You know, my advice to parents is, from the time that your children are small, build a network of other adults that are in your child's life that you trust, the cool aunts and uncles, the cousins, the coaches, the youth ministers, the people who can play a role that they're going to turn to even when they've decided to unfriend you. The people that you know will be in their ecosystem because, you know, and that will be looking out for them and won't tell you when your son is swearing, but will tell you when things are much more serious. How do you find that balance? And I think this is where surveillance has become this crutch in many ways, where we expect parents to do all the work of keeping their children safe. We expect parents to be the ones checking up on everything. And we don't recognize how that process of surveillance fundamentally destroys a bond of trust that is absolutely critical for making it through those years. And what I mean by this is that, you know, when young people go from transitioning of, you know, being in your arms and being the, you know, cuddly, snuggly little ones to being their own independent individuals, there is a process of them moving from thinking of you as the first and primary person to wanting to interact with all of the people around them. This is part of that transition. And yet what happens is that, you know, the trust conversation has to sort of shift from being something that's just implicit to something that's constantly nurtured and negotiated. It's a process of communication. It's a process of doing a lot of symbolism, a lot of like, I'm going to let you go, and in return, I'm going to hope that you will be good in return. Surveillance, I mean, this is classic Foucault, right? Surveillance comes in and is a mechanism in which we assert power over people. And we do this with our young people all the time. We assert power over them, and then we expect them to trust us. It doesn't work like this. And this is one of the reasons I think we're in an uncomfortable place in the society. Certainly, you know, it's having a conversation of surveillance in general, which, you know, is about, you know, government authority, about parental authority, all of these aspects. And I think this is tricky because I think that the surveillance conversation with regard to parenting is being driven by technical tools that people want to sell. And there's nothing more effective than making you absolutely terrified so that you will then go and buy a key monitoring system. But in terms of building out that process, it's about really supporting young people, giving them that freedom, dealing with the consequences, and going back and forth so that when they come off to college, they're pretty okay to be independent.
I'm hoping we can move over to Liz as well, and she had really brought up some good questions about privacy concerns and parental surveillance. So I'm hoping you can elaborate as well.
So I guess I was wondering, so you do bring up these concerns about parental surveillance. The one thing I've heard from some of my undergrads is maybe less of a concern about corporate surveillance or data mining. So which would be the tracking of online activities that companies can use to then advertise better. So I'm sorry. Should I repeat the question? Okay. So in addition to these concerns about parental surveillance, I guess I'm specifically wondering about teens and corporate surveillance or data mining practices. So selling information about users to companies to advertise. And so I'm just wondering if this is a concern that you hear from teens, or if there's a level of comfort or an understanding that this is just the price of admission to participate in these social networks.
Sure. So Chris Hufnagel at the University of California, Berkeley has been doing phenomenal cross-generational studies trying to understand how people feel about surveillance with regard to corporations and governments. And what he's consistently found is that young people care as much as adults, which is to say not at all. Which is always great. Sure enough, what I find when I sort of dive in and talk to teens about it is that they want a place of their own. This is the one viable option. Where else are they to go? And I think this is where I struggle with this conversation, because in many ways this is a conversation about capitalism. And, you know, of course, in an academic conversation we can have a critique of you know, the contemporary construct of capitalism and how America's instantiation functions. But when it comes to young people, they're just like, this is the world I live in. Why am I not allowed to participate in this? And I have to say that that's a fair question. Now that said, they're not dumb. They're more than well aware of how commercial different aspects of this stuff are. And so what I've been delighted by is watching teenagers who will mess with it. And so, for example, there is nothing funnier to a 15-year-old boy than getting his friends to get inappropriate advertisements because Gmail has done something based on the data. And so I will watch these teenagers who sit there and they'll write their messages back and forth, and then they'll highlight it and make it white text so that it's white on white and can't be seen, and then be ecstatic when their friends get diapers ads, because that's awesome, right? And you see this moment of being so aware of the advertising ecosystem that you're willing to mess with it. I saw this with regard to Facebook, where whether or not this is actually how the algorithm works during this era, I will never know. Facebook refused to answer these questions of mine, but teenagers had come to the conclusion that if they put brands into their statuses, that they would appear high on the news feed. So you'd see these status updates, which were like, my friend, blah blah blah, whatever, Nike, and you were like, what? And it's like, oh yeah, well if I put Nike, it'll appear up there. And so what that shows to me is that young people are paying attention to it. They're trying to deal with it. Even the things that they don't like, you know what? The ability to hang out with their friends is always going to trump it. And so this is also where I say, why then do we put the onus on young people to figure out how to critique or challenge our capitalist structures? If we don't like the reality of capitalism we're living in, that's our responsibility as adults. Let's not burden young people with this. Let's let them have their freedom.
All right, we have our first question from the Twitter sphere.
Usually not good with mics. Can everyone hear me? All right, awesome. So the first question, actually it's two questions. I'll just ask one of them though. Have you encountered any differences in the meaning of privacy across cultures and groups in your work?
Yeah. When I started this project, I was working with a lot of global scholars, and we were talking a lot about how privacy operated around the globe. And friends of mine who were working in environments that were dealing with repressive regimes were talking about the sophisticated ways in which political dissidents would go and hide in plain sight, right? Chinese dissidents who would use the games with language in order to put things up that would not be recognized by the Chinese censors, right? A whole variety of things. And I was like, this is really fascinating, because guess what? I see teenagers doing this all the time. And what I started to realize is that because of those dynamics of power, what's at stake in terms of how young people negotiate privacy looks a lot more like political dissident work globally than adult practices. And so what you realize is that privacy is a response to a system of power. Privacy is a response to having to deal with any aspect of people who hold power over you, who want to be in your business. And so in order to achieve privacy, you can't simply control access to the content. That actually is not the way to successfully manage privacy. And this is hard in a technical conversation where we think that access control lists will solve our problems. In fact, privacy is a process in which you are constantly seeking to achieve. And in order to achieve privacy, you need to have agency or power within a social situation in order to be able to control that social situation. You need to understand the context of it. You need to understand who's going to share things in a way that violates what your expectations are. You need to understand what the expectations of the tools are. And then you need to have the ability, the skills to manage this, right? And these skills are a process in which you learn it. And so, of course, you spend time in a middle school or a high school, and what you will find is that, a young person figures out that, Susie over here spreads everything. So you can't tell her any secrets because she'll tell everybody. And so then what ends up happening is that when you want something to spread, you tell Susie and you tell her not to tell anybody. And of course, knowing it will then go everywhere. But it becomes this way of understanding the school environment in terms of what will spread and what not. The ability to control a social situation, the ability to achieve privacy online is very much complicated by the technologies, by the expectations of adults to look in on this. And so when it began, when I started watching what teenagers were doing before their parents had come online, they spent a lot of time trying to manage it through technical means. As their parents came online, as their parents became much more interested in every detail of what they were saying, young people stopped trying to control access to content and started trying to control access to meaning, which is the beautiful way of hiding in plain sight. So I'll give this as a concrete and delightfully geeky example, which is that I met this young woman named Carmen out in Boston. And Carmen is of Argentinian descent, which is relevant to this explanation because she knows that her mother will not understand British cultural references. And so she decides that she wants to tell all of her friends that she's having a really lousy day. She and her boyfriend had broken up, and she was just struggling with it. And so she did what most teenagers do, which is try to find the perfect song lyric to express all of your emotions. But she knew if she posted a sappy song lyric that her mother would think she was suicidal. It had happened before. Her mother tended to overreact to things. So she wanted to sort of trigger her friends to give her support and validation and love without getting her mother concerned. So she posted song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, for those who do not know this Monty Python skit, this is The Life of Brian, where the key character is being crucified during this song. There is nothing happy about this song. But her mother sort of immediately jumps onto Facebook and says, "It looks like you're having a great day." And her friends immediately text her, right? Because they had all seen the movie together. And it was this kind of transformation, which is over time, which I thought was really phenomenal. What was really notable in my fieldwork in the US was that the more that young people were facing constant surveillance by different actors, the more they were going to get sophisticated about privacy, which meant that there was a huge class and race aspect to this. And in environments where young people were under state surveillance because the state was their guardian, things became much more complicated than in communities where things were more privileged. But I think that that variability in the US and globally, it really does come down to these questions of power. How does it get exerted? How is it negotiated? How do young people achieve their own senses of freedom in spite of these systems of authority?
Just to follow up with that too, Austin had come up with a really good question related to privacy and power in professional situations. I'm hoping you can follow up.
Yeah. So just after reading your book, you talked about a lot about like privacy in the social sphere. But I just wanted to ask you about like privacy in terms of academic and professional, and what does your research indicate about the dangers that youth might face in regards with their professional academic life?
Right. So I'll begin with a story that I'm sure you saw in the book, which is that at the beginnings of MySpace's popularity, I received a phone call from an Ivy League admissions officer. They had received an application from a young man living in South Central in Los Angeles, and he had written this beautiful college essay about wanting to leave behind the gangs in which he grew up in. And they went to his MySpace, and they were sort of proud of themselves, sort of looking up on people. And they went to his MySpace, and they found that his profile was filled with gang insignia, references to different gang acts, things that were very indicative of the fact that he was very fluent in participatory in gang culture. And they asked me a question, which was, why would he lie to us when we can tell the truth online? And I was really struggling with this conversation because I spent a lot of time in South Central, and my experience is that participation in gangs had become a survival mechanism. Your cousins, your siblings, your parents were often gang affiliated, not to mention your classmates, and it became this way of really surviving. And so I saw this moment in which this college admissions officer was so removed from this context that was unable to understand a totally different context and was interpreting things in the context of this privileged elite institution. The reason I think this is important with regard to jobs in the future is that further there's a gap between the power and the decision makers and the lives or struggles that the individuals are experiencing, the more that they're going to be judged in ways that are disconnected and challenging. So we often get anxious about privileged young people who have pictures of drinking beer online. Frankly, I'm not worried about them. Who I'm worried about are young people in this country who don't have access to these kinds of resources, who don't have access to networks, who are not visible because they are judged based on hegemonic or based on very powerful understandings of what society should be like. And so the place where I'm starting seeing this play out has to do with the way in which some companies are starting to use LinkedIn with regard to their hiring practices. So they go on LinkedIn and they see, who else does this applicant know that works in my company? So it's not about what that applicant put on their page, it's who else they know. Are they already one of us? Are they already like us? And of course, the further someone is from positions of privilege, the less likely that they're going to have connections into that powerful company. And indeed, if you deal with certain tech companies, they will actually interview and say, who else do you know that works here? And we think about the ways in which that biases things. And this is where I point out that it's not just the content, but it's always the metadata that matters as well. Because a lot of this conversation ends up coming down to not just what young people themselves portray about themselves, but the ways in which they're structurally positioned within these broader networks. And I think that's where I'm getting very concerned about it, because you can make decisions about how you're choosing to put up the red cup or not, but you can't make decisions necessarily about who you know, especially if you come from more marginalized communities.
So I don't have like a real example, but I know, like, just reading some articles, seeing some students who may have said something really stupid online or said something that got them in a lot of trouble, and not having, having that mistake always online and always part of their lives, I just, I kind of emphasize with that because I feel like everyone makes mistakes.
Absolutely.
How can we, is there any way that we can erase like a mistake like that if there's like an article about a student who did something really stupid and it's always going to be there? What have you learned about social media in a way that can help kids in that situation?
Yeah. The irony of all of this is that young people are basically getting to live with the challenges of celebrity. And the challenges of celebrity are not particularly delightful always. So I see all these teenagers who be like, I want to be famous because if I was famous, then I'd have so much freedom. And I'm like, oh, you have no idea. Fame doesn't necessarily give you freedom. It comes with massive costs. Britney Spears, of course, just take a look what's written about her online. And unfortunately, what you see is this sort of lighter reality of this, not just about what the individuals make mistakes, but the ways in which their friends make decisions or put things up about them that they have to live with. I think one of the big challenges that we have to figure out as a society, and not just as a set of individuals, but as a society, is how to let people live down those mistakes. And to say, you know what, I messed up, and that's part of my past. Now, I do have hope for this, in part because if you think about the last 3 presidents in this country, it went from I smoked and I didn't inhale to yes, I did coke, but then I found God, to yep, get over it, right? And like that's a really interesting transformation in 3 presidents. Unfortunately, that will mean that individual young people will suffer challenges because of these moments of transformation. One of the things that I think is really interesting is when young people are willing to, stand up and say, this is my mistake. This is what I did. This is, I made this mistake. My friend put up this. I'm going to put it into context. And that becomes a powerful way of just sort of getting in front of it. And I see some teenagers really doing that, saying like, this is my reality. Can we, deal with it? Of course, some of you may have seen a piece that went around yesterday, which was really interesting, from a young woman who's currently a student at Duke, who decided to make it very visible that she engaged in making pornographic content to pay for her college education. And the way that she handled it was really interesting because she said, yes, I understand that you want to be critical of me, and I understand the questions of misogyny within the pornographic industry, but why am I the one that's shamed rather than all of the people who consume this content? Why am I not recognized for my needs to pay for college and the absolute lack of affordability of college in this country? And it was a really interesting moment where she sort of pivoted the conversation. And that's a very extreme example, but I'm seeing young people try to do this. Is it perfect? No. We're going to live and deal with our mistakes. I definitely have to face mine, and they're definitely written down on my permanent record. And I wish there was an easy way through it, but I think this is one of the challenges that we get in light of this environment. I will say that we are in an interesting moment where we're experimenting with more ephemeral media. Snapchat is a really good example of this. And so I think that we have these different transformations that are happening, but I think that it will be a challenge to figure out how we want to react as a society.
In the vein of ephemeral media, and kind of a trigger word has been bullying over the last few years. I'm hoping that Elizabeth can follow up a little bit with her questions on bullying.
I understand from reading your book that bullying online is reflective of bullying in real life. But do you see are there any correlations between socioeconomic groups, between urban, rural, suburban schools? Is bullying online or bullying by social media more prevalent or more common in certain groups of kids? And what can a parent do? I mean, when should a parent step in?
Yeah. Bullying is a really hard one. You've read the book, so you have the cheat sheet, but I'm gonna give a sort of context for everyone else, which is that there's this assumption that bullying is so much worse on the internet than ever before. But actually, it's been interesting that study after study has shown that if you stabilize the definition of bullying, we haven't seen a rise for the last 30 years, which is really confusing, and we have to sort of puzzle that one out. What I started to realize is that the definitions of bullying used by adults basically deal with the entire range of meanness and cruelty, from lightweight teasing and joking around to serious forms of criminal harassment. That academics have a much more localized notion of bullying, where by and large they refer to psychological, physical, social aggression repeated over time by people of differential physical or social power. Interestingly, young people's definitions of bullying are relatively aligned to academics, which is really weird, right? Like, that shouldn't happen. But it basically refers to the mean kid picking on or the big kid picking on the little kid, the cool kid picking on the geek. That young people use different language to refer to other aspects of meanness and cruelty, from drama to pranking and punking to all of this stuff. So then there's this question of what happens that this stuff, moves beyond just what happens in the school, and it happens all over the place. What I started to realize, which was really challenging in this, is that it's not just that the meanness and cruelty spills out online and goes into the home, but also the kindness and love that comes around this. And this is a really challenging bit to it, because you'll see, horrible acts of meanness, and then you'll see young people sort of coming on saying, "I love you" and whatnot. So much so that we started to see a practice of digital self-harm, which is that young people would anonymously write questions themselves on Ask.fm or FormSpring that were cruel questions themselves, that then they would immediately respond to and sort of in ways that would elicit support by all their friends, which is really terrifying to think about. Now, to your general question about the aspects of socioeconomic and other factors in this, if you look at survey research about bullying, which is, of course, a small segment of the broader spectrum, what you will find is that it is correlated with a variety of factors, including race, including socioeconomic factors, including abuse, alcoholism, mental health issues, et cetera, that in particular, that those who engage in acts of perpetration, bullying, will themselves be victimized in other aspects of their lives. And so you will see this having a class dynamic as a result of this. This is also one of the reasons why punitive modes are deadly for this, because punitive modes assume that we can punish our way out without actually having empathy for those who are often themselves in really bad places where they're then lashing out. Now, in terms of meanness and cruelty writ large, one of the things that's challenging to me about all of this that is spilled out online is that this has become normative in American society as how we want to do our politics, right? Turn on TV, how we want to do reality TV entertainment is meanness and cruelty for sport. And what's challenging is when I sit and spend time in young people's homes, I find that meanness and cruelty is often demonstrated by parents with little awareness of how this normalizes things. Talking about your, talking poorly about your boss, about your colleagues at work. And the reality is that populations who are under greater levels of stress tend to be more exhibitionist of that form of frustration, which means that we do see a socioeconomic aspect to this. But we also see a weird stressor aspect in the more privileged classes, which is that parents under tremendous amounts of stress exhibit these lashing out in their environments. And so this is why the whole picture around bullying gets very messy very fast. What's challenging for me is that I see all of this cruelty online, and my hope when I started seeing all of this sort of play out, my hope was that we as a society would step back and think about the fact that young people are showing us all of this meanness and cruelty, that they're demonstrating and reproducing what we're doing. Of course, that was a nice hope. The reality is that we just want to shut down the technology, hoping it will go away. But I think that the space of meanness and cruelty online is really, really difficult. And it's very clear that the interventions that are needed around this are not about blocking the technology. That won't make any aspect of this go away. It's really about social emotional learning. It's really about interventions at the psychological or community levels. It's really about trying to think about it holistically as a society. And we're not there. And I'm frustrated by our legislators who basically think that we can punish our way out of this. And all of the data from the scholars that I deeply respect suggests that punitive measures are about to make things much, much worse. And that's really sad to me.
Do we have more from the Twitter sphere?
Yes. Let me see if I'm wording this right. What is the relationship between adults' fear about kids using technology and moral panics about youth culture of 1920s through the 1980s?
Yeah. So Alice Marwick, one of my colleagues and collaborators, wrote a brilliant piece at the beginnings of the MySpace anxieties, where she basically talked about how these aspects of techno-panics continue to get reproduced in ways that are obviously moral panics. I think that there's an amazing number of parallels, which is that any new media that's embraced overwhelmingly by young people is usually feared for all that it will do to our children. And of course, if we go all the way back, it's part of it is delightful because they seem so impossible to imagine in contemporary environments. My favorite moral panic in American history is the panic about the sewing machine. The concern about the sewing machine is that women would rub their legs up and down all day long on the sewing machine, that it would destroy their sexuality. I just love this, right? Like, that's just phenomenal. When it comes to young people, we had a whole period where the idea of them escaping into alternate realities would destroy their ability to participate in life. This was our concern over novels, which is really hard to imagine now. This is another element of it. There has been a lot of moral panics. Now, of course, what a moral panic fundamentally is, if we sort of go back to the cultural studies history of this, is that the panic is about what is an imagined understanding of how this particular technology, this particular media, will destroy the basic moral fabric of our society. And that is something that we see with these technologies, and it almost always comes down to sexuality. It comes down to youth culture and their ability to mature, et cetera. So it wasn't surprising to me that the first moral panic that was sort of driven because of these technologies, because of social media, was driven around sexual predation. And what's really frustrating to me about the sexual predation conversation is that we use this conversation to not pay attention to the very real risks that young people faced. So, for example, the conversation of sexual predation is that a 40-year-old guy is going to come and grab a child off of the internet randomly, and then terrible things will happen. What's difficult is that there was a particular piece of scholarly research that is really phenomenal that was misused for this. This is the work by David Finkelhor at the Crimes Against Children Research Center. He found that 1 in 5 originally, and then a follow-up study of 1 in 7 young people were sexually solicited online. This was used by the Ad Council to say that there are predators everywhere. Well, the thing that was interesting about his report is that most sexual solicitations are by teenagers' peers. Those who are not from their peers are from the young adult range of 18 to 22. What's interesting is that the young people who were reporting this basically were not emotionally upset by it. So what was going on there? Well, his group decided to follow up and look at sexual crimes that actually occurred because of the internet. And what they found is that they fit into a very typical portrait, which was that young people would often say that they were much older than they were. They would engage on the environment that was most recently popular but was no longer popular. So when MySpace was really popular, it was about chat rooms. When Facebook was really popular, it was about MySpace, et cetera. And they would engage in sexual conversations with older adults, knowing that they were older, knowing that they were interested in sex. They would meet up for sex, and they would do so repeatedly, believing that they were in love. These dynamics, of course, fit into our legislative category of statutory rape. And they're deeply problematic for all of the reasons that we talk about power in statutory rape. But what was really troubling was that the young people who were engaging in these practices were most likely to be coming from environments where they were abused at home, they were dealing with alcoholism and addiction, they were dealing with mental health crises or trying to figure out sexuality. Basically, they were looking for attention in all the wrong ways. And so then we rather than actually looking and appreciating their challenges, we sort of try to age segregate further down the line. The reason that I think that it's important to note this moral panic is that people do face sexual risks. Young people are not likely to be abducted by strangers. They're not likely to necessarily even be sexually abused by strangers. But rape is a very real thing. And rather than talking about the dynamics of sexual abuse amongst peers, we keep creating these mythical 40-something that we have to worry about, rather than actually helping young people deal with the sexual victimization that they might encounter, without helping them figure out how to be critically engaged. And we use this to justify a way of separating young people from adults, when actually young people need adults to get support, when they need adults when they're actually hurting. And I think the place where I see this, and the place where I really struggled with this, is in the LGBT community, which is that when I grew up online, the internet was a place where people came out. I came out online. We saw a massive decline in suicide rates correlated with coming out online. That changed in the mid-2000s. We stopped seeing that correlation. And what I saw on the ground was that young people would keep telling me that they weren't going to talk to strangers online because strangers were dangerous. Even when they were getting beaten up in school, even when their parents kicked them out of the house, that they wouldn't reach out to and engage with strangers. And that was killing me. And then I saw the It Gets Better campaign started by Dan Savage. And what was challenging for me about this was I saw all of these young people make videos hoping that they would find support, hoping that adults would come in and be caring with them. And instead, what they found was that they just got further harassed by their classmates in school because they made a YouTube video to be a part of a campaign, and they never got the support structures that they were hoping for from that campaign. What I'm really struggling with, and I don't have data on, and if anybody can help me, that would be fantastic, is that for the year following the campaign, I tracked every suicide that was reported in the media, and then found that most of those kids had made It Gets Better campaigns in that preceding year. And that kills me, right? Because if we are at a point where we use these moral panics, that we use them in a way that fragments our society, that we don't provide the structures and the support, especially for our most vulnerable populations, I think that we really do serious harm.
We're going to move through a couple more questions up here. If you have questions in the audience, if you can line up or at least signal to me that you'd like to ask Danah a question, and then make your way up to the front here, that'd be really useful, and we can call on you as we have time. But I'm hoping that we can move towards kind of a more solutions-based, I guess, discussion about media literacy. And Liz has some really good questions about media literacy.
So media literacy is something that you advocate for in the book, and something that I'm interested in myself as a researcher, and also trying to think about that in teaching. But I'm wondering what opportunities or initiatives or programs are out there for teens, or anyone for that matter, to develop these critical media literacy skills. And as a sort of maybe side question, is it necessary to know how to program or code? I've heard that argument made that this is something that you really need to develop, but it seems like there's not a lot of resources to do that right now.
Good and hard question. You know, the scary thing is that the young people that I see that develop the most sophisticated media and digital literacies at this point are mostly doing it on their own, through experimentation, through deep engagement, through supportive communities. What that ends up meaning in practice is that it's the most privileged youth. And that they're given the opportunities to explore this because they're given interest-driven learning opportunities to connect and do things that are really powerful. One of the reasons why I'm such an advocate for conversations around media literacy is that we use this digital natives rhetoric to justify not having to actually help young people figure these things out. We figure they're young, they'll figure it out on their own, and that's just not true. This is a process. It requires really learning, and it requires actually recognizing that this is of critical importance to us as a society. I would love to think that we could just sort of after school ourselves a way out of it, but I actually think that especially for vulnerable populations, we need to figure out how to bake it into the fabric of our core curricula. In terms of coding and coding literacy, the systems that we are dealing with right now are increasingly sophisticated technically. The understanding of something as basic as an algorithm is really key if you want to understand how you're getting something back from a search engine query. right? We used to teach young people, of course, the librarian geek in me is sort of delighted. We used to teach people how to use card catalogs, but it wasn't just the process of working with a card catalog. It was understanding how information was organized, how it was structured, why it appeared in this location, how we understand it. That's database literacy. The funny thing about it is that as things went digital, we just were like, oh, you'll know what to put into Google. It's no big deal. It's like, no, actually, the process of writing a query is understanding how information is organized and how to think about it. And so part of it for me is that I don't need everybody to want to be a software engineer. That's not, the goal here. But I need to be confident that people's engagements with these technologies understand how those systems are built, how they are biased, why some results will appear at the top and not others, why these systems will learn from you, and why we're starting to see huge differentiation, right? Because what ends up happening is that learning algorithms will based on you and your network and all of these other factors, which means even something as simple as a search query, we start to see hugely biased results depending on where you are within a network on Google Circles or within your environment. And I think that's challenging to me. And so this is, in order to be media literate at this point, you have to have some level of fluency about how these technologies operate. But I think that it's not necessarily about knowing the latest programming language or being able to build your own website as much as it is to understand the fundamentals. And frankly, the best way to do that is to muck around with code for a bit, which is why I see that there. In terms of programs, there's amazing after-school programs in each jurisdiction. But it requires a lot more than that.
All right, let's check in once more with the Twitter sphere. Austin, anything good?
Yeah, there's a few good ones. This is from a parent. How can our behavior as parents or grandparents, which we control, be positive for youth who we can't and shouldn't control?
Yeah. The first bit of advice that I give for parents who are concerned enough to be engaging with me is don't focus so much on your children as your children's friends. What I mean by that is that we need to actually be building a community where we're all collectively looking out for what's going on. And if you are a concerned parent, if you are engaged with your children, likely things are going to be okay. I mean, there's variations, there's the sneaking out of the house, there are things that'll go wrong, but by and large, things are going to be okay. I am deeply concerned about parents who are not engaged, and we don't acknowledge how many of those parents exist within our own communities, and how much our children get to see their peers struggle through things and not necessarily know who to turn to. And so, for parents who are caring and concerned, it's like, how do you be there for, your child's friends, for your child's community? Because if you do that, you will do, amazing things that will end up helping your child. This can be a selfish act, but in the process of being community-oriented, we can actually help, all around. The other thing I really recommend for parents is check your hypocrisy. And the reason I say this is that I'm amazed by, parents are like, my child is looking at, their device all day, and it's just like so are you. And so it's these moments of saying, if we want to have standards or expectations within our household, how do we make certain that we're living up to them? And this is where, I opened the book with an example of a football game where, of course, the teenagers are running around talking to each other and the parents are all on their devices, right? And then we're always surprised when the teenagers are on their devices when parents have decided that this is parent time. So I think part of it is like, think about how you're role modeling, think about your decisions, and realize that teenagers are very astute to the idea of hypocrisy. But generally, calm down, be engaged, be attentive listeners, provide networks for your children of other adults, be there for other children that are in your community. These kinds of very social things will go a long way.
All right. If there's no questions from the audience, we'll take a couple more. Oh, we got one right here.
Hi. So I've noticed, back to your sense of community, I've noticed that in certain geographic regions in the U.S., talk about the U.S., there is a tremendous sense of community in certain places. The Midwest, the Northwest, Minneapolis, nice, all that good stuff, right? But there are also some places, I have a lot of colleagues in Silicon Valley, who don't know their next door neighbors. So I've seen this tremendous geographic dependence and sense of community. And I'm sure you mentioned a lot about the demographic and the socioeconomic demographics and so forth. But do you have any comments on that? Have you noticed something similar?
Yeah, you know, two areas where in privileged environments I see devastating community effects are Silicon Valley and DC. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that people move into there for a professional sector and don't focus on the geography. They don't have roots in really significant ways. Those are the places where I see it be most challenging in the privileged environments. I spend a lot of time in New Orleans watching the transition post-Katrina. And of course, you see these moments of working class communities having gotten completely devastated and fragmented, as you saw how movement and geography really transformed it. One of the things that I struggle with on the issues of community is that it's not something that just magically falls from the sky. It's a process that has to be constantly worked and negotiated and dealt with. And it has a historical challenge that has to do with the role of women in work, which is that historically it was women who managed community. When women went to work, it wasn't men that were picking up the slack on that one. And so what we end up seeing is these huge socioeconomic factors around that, and it goes in different directions because in working class communities where women are often the sole breadwinner, it's not men within the community that are actually necessarily knitting it together either. So I mean, I find these things really complicated because of all of these other social factors. To a certain degree, parents try to pick up some of this when they're starting out on play dates and all the way up into school-based dynamics, but it doesn't necessarily connect it to the geography. I would love to figure out how to get people to slow down and pay attention, but we have a variety of issues in our country with regard to people's time allocations, especially adults, and there are some massive issues there. And I don't know that there's like one way of fixing it. And for me, it's not a question of whether or not we're bowling alone. It's a question of whether we're finding other ways of building community, not just to support us as individuals, which actually I think is relatively doing well, but to support us as entire families. And this is also where I say there's another big trend in things, which is, again, it comes back to this age segregation. We don't support intergenerational dynamics, especially in communities where there's not a religious component. Religion is one of the places where I see intergenerational, but even in places where we've seen megachurches pop up, that actually age segregates. So it's sort of this weird, flip to it all, because intergenerational works much better when you don't have the teen Sunday school and the middle school Sunday school and the elementary school Sunday school, which is what we see in the megachurches. So I mean, I think it's messy, and I don't know that there's a solution to it as much as it's a process that we have to figure out how to negotiate. So I can see the issues, but I'm not sure what the right way through it is.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to follow up on what you were just saying about intergenerational things. And one thing that's really surprising, I'm not a parent, but I know that you can recall what it's like to have been a certain age and to understand your youth and go back. And what's surprising to me is adults are the ones who are responsible for inventing this technology and for driving it forward. Why is there this disparity or this gap between being able to relate to your child's behavior in this product that has been created, and also is that gap something that can be closed if there's a different perception or there's a different approach?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts. One is that in wealthier parts of American society, the age of first childbearing has increasingly gotten high over the last couple of generations, which is that it's not uncommon in wealthier communities for people to be in their 30s before they have a child. And of course, I'm completely guilty of this. The challenge is that further distance from those memories of what it meant to be a teenager than if you were 20 having your first child. The dynamics of teen culture is like we remember certain things. Our memories are fallible. Our memories remember our friends. We remember certain adventures. We remember the things we got into trouble over. We don't remember how overwhelming the feeling of boredom was. And teens, you spend there and it's sitting there in class, right? And they're just like, oh. We don't remember just the constant jarring of the school bell. We don't remember some of those visceral issues. Now, these technologies, interestingly, are, have primarily been built by people who themselves are in the 20s, and they're primarily doing it for different kinds of social interaction. It often is to fill a gap of 20-something social interaction, right? Friendster was actually designed by the developer in order to get a date, right? MySpace had a lot to do with the idea of being able to connect with friends, and it quickly became about music because one of the founders was really passionate about music. And the thing is that what is really popular amongst 20-somethings inevitably gets popular amongst those who are slightly younger. And I think this is what we often miss with it, because we think that teenagers are leading the way. Actually, the best way to get teenagers involved is when it's really cool for 22-year-olds. And this is where these jokes of magazines, like 16 magazine, that's read by 12-year-olds, right? Like we have these sort of, or 17 magazines read by 12-year-olds. Like you have these gaps. I think that it's challenging because the use of these technologies is life stage specific, which is that even something, say like Twitter, right? I'm always love talking to journalists who think that they understand Twitter because they use it passionately. It happens to be the journalist tool of choice. They're always surprised. I'm like, teenagers don't share links. And they're like, oh, how could you use Twitter without sharing links? And I'm like, oh, you live in a different world, right? And so you see these same technologies being morphed by different cohorts depending on what they're trying to do. And I think that's actually one of the beauty of it, is that these technologies may have been implemented by people who are older, but they're totally co-constructed by people who are much younger, who are doing things that the designers and the developers never could have imagined. And the tools that are most successful in this domain are the tools that are very much co-created.
All right, I think we'll check in with Twitter one more time and see if we have a question from there.
This is kind of keeping with the similar theme. How is it that adults are so far removed from the thought processes of children when it has always been part of their own DNA?
Yeah, and let's see what else. So one of the things I'm going to sort of consider, we answered some of this before, I'm going to take it into a different way that I'm really, really struggling with right now. And again, this is sort of a pitch to the audience, since many of you are scholars who can help me figure something out. In the 1890s, G. Stanley Hall started talking about adolescence, really famous transformative psychological work. This got picked up by a whole set of religious communities in the early 1900s to talk about how we needed to create a separate world for young people because they were especially vulnerable. They were especially, needed to be protected. And this was something that was really driven by a lot of Christian organizations during this era, but was pretty much ignored by the mainstream. Until in the 1920s, when we started to see collapses of economic opportunities in the US as we led into the Depression. And as we moved into the Depression, we had this sort of problem because there were just simply not enough jobs available for young men, or for men in general, let alone young men. And a lot of older men were concerned that their jobs were being displaced by younger folks. We created compulsory high school as we know it in response to this by using the rhetorics of adolescence and the logic of what was happening in labor. And that creation of compulsory high school is one of the reasons that we get these great 1950s images, because it wasn't just the high school we created high school sports, we created high school dances, we did all of these things that made this a period of isolation. What's been fascinating is that we are moving in a contemporary environment where I would argue we're doing the same thing. That we're using brain science, the idea that young people's brains are not developed before they're 25, in which there's some really, really powerful scholarly research that argues different aspects of this. But we use that to then say that this is all the more reason in which we should actually exclude young people from every aspect of public life. Because clearly their brains aren't developed, clearly they don't have the wherewithal to be a part of anything. And of course, my snarky response to this is that we make exclusions when it involves sending young people off to war, where we appreciate their risk-taking as long as they can die for our country, which is sort of my grouchy response to this. That aside, we value entrepreneurship, we value creativity, but we really want to contain this group, and we're using the conversation around the brain to justify it. This is not to say that there's not these huge transformations that go on, and of course, many of us can even recall our willingness to take risks that were fundamentally stupid 10 years ago. We did things that we are ashamed of, and the thing that we forget is that we lived this down, we learned from it, and because we want to protect young people, we don't want to allow them to do the things that we did. We don't want them to break bones. But the challenge is that in our obsession with not letting them break their bones, we don't let them have bumps or bruises along the way. And I think that this is one of the reasons that I worry about a lot of this culture of fear, because the culture of fear is all about ramping things up, convincing everyone that things are so much worse. And the thing is that I talk to a 20-year-old and I'm just like, wow, we are in a different life stage, right? And we experience this and we have these emotional distances that then we don't encourage young people to sort of experiment and be exposed to the freedoms that will allow them to grow. And so I struggle with how to then figure out how we deal with that, because it's like we actually need to encourage people to try things out, to take risks. But how do we do this in a way where we want to protect our children? And I think, again, we see these distances of age, we see these distances of experience. We do not have intergenerational dynamics, and I think it's challenging, because I think that we have to step back and support young people to go out there and do stupid things.
We have time for one more question from the audience. Do we have someone who's got a question? Yeah, come on up. It's a long walk. No, take your time.
Hi. I was curious because you mentioned and you kind of correlated a few ideas. Technology dependent on privilege, and in our society it seems as though we share information more readily in university. So I was wondering if with DIY communities, there are more centers popping up. Is there something that could be created for teenagers?
Yeah. So I'm excited by a lot of, being a part of the MacArthur network around digital media and learning. One of the things I got really excited by was all of these amazing centers where people could come and they could play and they could engage. And many of these were even free. But the thing that we forget is that it's not everybody who has the ability to spend the time to do that. It has to be valued, it has to be recognized. And so I think that young people who do get to be a part of these institutions often get tremendous support. I'm also seeing very classic organizations, Boys and Girls Clubs, Girl Scouts, these kinds of structures try to rethink what their role is in this digital environment. And again, we see possibilities for it, but of course we see an extraordinarily low levels of funding, extraordinarily low levels of support within the community, and it becomes these really difficult challenges in terms of what we make available for youth. I think that again, it's one of those things, I see so much potential to do really great learning environments. And we see, there are some, examples, some amazing examples in Chicago, Nicole Pinker's put together. There's some examples even in New York where I live, but they become almost one-offs rather than thinking about it holistically, and I think that's where I struggle with these issues. To your question about sharing and participating, I think I want to point out that part of this has to do with this calculus between opportunities and consequences. So younger folks often share because they see so much potential about what they could gain from it. Attention, validation being one aspect of it, opportunities, the possibility of becoming famous being sort of realistic elements of it. whereas adults tend to be much more afraid of all of the things that they have to lose, particularly more privileged adults. And I think that calculus is also where it feeds into these kinds of opportunities and structures, which is that one of the things that ends up happening is that these organizations end up being adult-driven, and they end up being driven by adults' expectations of how you have to gain things, and they're more legitimate. And so instead of sharing and participating in social environments, let's go and put you in another learning environment from 3 to 5 after school. And that's great in certain ways, but it also means that these programs are strongly encouraged to just do things that are educational. And I think that this is where I want to highlight that the fact that, my snarky joke, of course, is that we often let education get in the way of learning. But there's a lot more learning that goes on than just the things that are officially in the DIY. And indeed, if you spend time in, say, like the Boys and Girls Club, and I've spent lots of time in different clubs around the country, you see that even as they're sort of doing more official educational stuff, there's a lot of informal learning, a lot of social dynamic going on. And so this is where I see, those questions for me are bridged in really critical ways, because when they are driven by an educational paradigm, they don't allow for all the flexibility of learning. And that's one of those challenges of those programs, because they actually have to get resources. They have to often justify it as education. Because they have to sell it, and they often sell it to more privileged adults, they do it under the realm of education. And this is where I think that this whole thing gets really messy, because we need to really support learning in all of its forms. Sometimes it comes in the form of education, and sometimes it comes in the form of hanging out.
I want to thank Danah Boyd. I wish we could go on for many hours. It's been so lovely to have you here. Thank you for being part of our community today and beyond. I want to thank Liz, Elizabeth, and Austin for being part of this. Thank you for being here. Please remember that her book will be available right outside. Also, she'll be signing books and discussing that right there. So feel free to stay after and chat with Ms. Boyd. Thank you so much.
Thank you.